Captain William Fletcher found the cabin door standing open. That was the first sign that something was catastrophically wrong. In 22 years, no one had ever seen Eleanor Thorne's door open, not once. The woman who lived on Devil's Ridge kept her world sealed tight, day and night, winter and summer. But now, the November wind was howling through that doorway, scattering dead leaves across the threshold into the darkness beyond. Fletcher stepped closer. The door had not been forced. The hinges showed no damage. It had been opened from the inside. Deliberately, he called out her name. The mountain returned only silence. Inside the cabin, everything was in perfect order. The bed was made with military precision. The dishes were washed and stacked. The floor was swept clean. But Eleanor Thorne was gone. And on the table, arranged in a circle, were 7 stones, each one painted with a single word in what looked like dried blood. The words said, "It is free now, forgive me." This happened on November 14th, 1863, in the Cumberland Gap region of eastern Kentucky, during the bloodiest year of the Civil War. What Captain Fletcher would discover over the next 7 days would force him to question everything he believed about the nature of reality itself. And what you are about to hear is the complete truth, reconstructed from his personal journal that was hidden for over 100 years. And before we descend into the darkness of Devil's Ridge, if you are drawn to these dark corners of American history, the cases that were buried, the mysteries that were erased, the stories they did not want told, you need to subscribe to Appalachian Shadows right now. Because every week, I bring you a case like this from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Something real in spirit, something disturbing, something that challenges what you thought you knew about the limits of human understanding and the secrets hidden in the hollows. And this is one of the most inexplicable cases I have ever investigated. To understand what happened on Devil's Ridge in November of 1863, you need to understand Eleanor Thorne. But the truth is, no one really understood her. Not the families who lived in the valley below. Not the hunters who saw her silhouette against the sky at dawn and dusk. Not even the circuit preacher who tried once, only once, to bring her the word of God. Eleanor Thorne appeared in Pike County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1841. She arrived alone, on foot, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and wearing a black dress that had seen better days. She was perhaps 30 years old then, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and eyes that people later described as too knowing, as if she had seen things that aged the soul faster than the body. She purchased a piece of land on the highest inhabitable ridge in the region. The property was considered worthless by locals. The soil was rocky and infertile. The water source was a spring that froze solid 4 months of the year. The wind up there was relentless, howling through the pine trees with a sound that could drive a person mad with loneliness. But Eleanor paid cash for 20 acres and began building her cabin with her own hands. The families in the valley watched her work. Men offered to help. She refused every offer with a polite but firm thank you. Women brought food. She accepted it with gratitude, but never invited them inside. Children were curious and tried to approach. Eleanor would smile at them from a distance, but never let them come closer than 50 yards. Within 3 months, she had built a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney. She planted markers around the entire property, large river stones that she must have hauled up from the creek bed far below. The stones formed a perfect circle, 200 yards in diameter, with her cabin at the exact center. And then she spoke to her nearest neighbor, a farmer named Jacob Brennan, and made a request that everyone found strange but agreed to honor. She said, "I will never leave this property. I cannot leave it. Once a month, I will place a list of supplies I need on the southern marker stone. If you would be kind enough to purchase these items and leave them there, I will pay double the fair price." But I must ask something in return. Never cross the stone line. Never come to my door. Never call out to me. What I do here, I do alone. And it must remain that way." Jacob asked why. Eleanor's answer was simple and terrifying. "Because I am watching something. And if I stop watching even for a day, people will die." For 22 years, the community honored her request. Once a month, Jacob or one of his sons would ride up the winding trail to Devil's Ridge. They would find her list weighted down by a rock on the southern marker. They would collect the coin she left in a small leather pouch. They would ride into town, purchase flour, coffee, lamp oil, matches, fabric, whatever she needed. They would return and leave the supplies at the marker. They never crossed the line. They never saw her face up close after that first day, but they saw her silhouette. Every dawn and every dusk, Eleanor Thorne would emerge from her cabin and walk the perimeter of the stone circle. She carried something in her hands that looked like a book or journal. She would stop at each cardinal direction, north, south, east, west, and stand perfectly still for several minutes. Then she would continue her circuit. Rain or snow, summer heat or winter cold, she never missed a single dawn or dusk walk. The children made up stories about her. They called her the Witch of Devil's Ridge. They said she was keeping demons trapped inside the stone circle. The adults were more practical. They assumed she was simply mad, driven to solitude by some trauma in her past. The Civil War brought enough real horrors that people did not have time to worry about one strange woman on a mountain. Then, November 14th, 1863, arrived. It was the day Eleanor Thorne vanished, and it was the day the deaths began. The first victim was Thomas Whitmore, a hunter from the valley. Thomas had been tracking a wounded elk through the forest when he crossed onto what he thought was unclaimed land. He did not realize he had passed Eleanor's southern marker stone. The elk trail led him directly toward Devil's Ridge. When Thomas did not return home that night, his wife assumed he was camping, waiting for dawn to track the animal. But when he did not return the next day, she grew worried. When he did not return the third day, she asked for help. Jacob Brennan organized a search party. 6 men on horseback combed the forests around Devil's Ridge. They found Thomas Whitmore on the afternoon of November 17th, 3 days after Eleanor disappeared. He was hanging from a tree, not by a rope, by his own intestines. The men who found him said Thomas was still technically alive when they arrived, though barely. His eyes were open, his lips were moving. He was trying to say something. Jacob leaned close to hear the dying man's words. What Thomas Whitmore whispered with his last breath was this: "She was keeping it in. Now it is out. It knows my name." Thomas died seconds later. The men cut him down and brought his body back to the valley. A doctor examined the corpse and found something impossible to explain. The wounds that had eviscerated Thomas showed no signs of cutting or tearing. It was as if his abdomen had simply opened from the inside, the way a flower blooms. The doctor could offer no medical explanation for how a human body could do such a thing. Wait, think about this for a second. A hunter crosses an invisible boundary on a mountain. 3 days later, he is found dying in a way that defies medical explanation. And his last words suggest that something knows his name, something that had been contained but is now free. Drop a comment right now with your theory. Because this detail, it is going to matter at the end, and I want to see if anyone figures it out before we get there. The death of Thomas Whitmore sent a wave of terror through Pike County. People locked their doors. They kept their children inside. The older residents remembered Eleanor's warning from 22 years earlier. If I stop watching, people will die. Now she was gone, and someone was dead. The connection was impossible to ignore. But the community faced a unique problem. It was November of 1863. The Civil War was tearing the nation apart. Kentucky was technically a Union state, but Pike County sat right on the border with Virginia and West Virginia. Confederate raiders moved through these mountains regularly. Union patrols responded with force. Local law enforcement had effectively collapsed. There was no sheriff, there was no marshal, there was only survival. That is when Captain William Fletcher entered the story. Fletcher was a Union Army officer stationed at Camp Nelson in central Kentucky. He was 42 years old, a career military man who had fought in the Mexican War 15 years earlier. He was rational, disciplined, and utterly skeptical of anything that could not be explained by logic and evidence. Fletcher and his company of 32 soldiers were conducting a sweep through eastern Kentucky, hunting for Confederate sympathizers who were supplying information to rebel forces. They arrived in Pike County on November 19th, 5 days after Eleanor disappeared and 2 days after Thomas Whitmore's death. Jacob Brennan met Fletcher in the town square and told him everything. About Eleanor Thorne, about the 22 years of isolation, about the stone circle, about Thomas Whitmore dying in a way that made no sense. Fletcher listened with the patience of a man who had heard plenty of superstitious nonsense from frightened civilians during wartime. But then Jacob said something that changed Fletcher's expression. Jacob said, "Captain, 4 more people have died since Thomas Whitmore, all in the past 2 days, all in ways that cannot be explained, and all of them had one thing in common. They all crossed the stone line. They all went past Eleanor's markers into the circle where her cabin stands." Fletcher's skepticism wavered. 4 more deaths? In 2 days? He demanded details. Jacob provided them. The victims were 2 Confederate deserters who had been hiding in the mountains, a local teenage boy who had taken a dare from his friends, and a traveling preacher who had decided to climb Devil's Ridge to pray at Eleanor's cabin for her safe return. The Confederate deserters were found dead in their makeshift camp, their bodies twisted into positions that human spines should not be able to achieve. The teenage boy was discovered at the base of a cliff he had apparently jumped from, except the cliff was only 15 feet high and should not have been fatal. The preacher was found on the trail leading to Eleanor's cabin. His body showed no external injuries. He had simply stopped living, as if his heart had forgotten how to beat. Fletcher made a decision. He would investigate this personally. He selected 8 soldiers to accompany him and ordered the rest of his company to remain in the valley to maintain order and prevent panic. At dawn on November 20th, 9 Union soldiers rode up the winding trail toward Devil's Ridge. The journey took 2 hours. The trail was steep and treacherous, made worse by recent rain that had turned the path to mud. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped. The wind picked up. The pine trees grew denser, blocking out the weak November sunlight. By the time they reached the ridge, Fletcher felt as if they had entered another world entirely. The stone markers were exactly as Jacob had described them. Large river stones, each one roughly the size of a man's torso, placed at intervals of about 20 yards to form a perfect circle around Eleanor Thorne's property. Fletcher rode slowly along the perimeter, studying the markers. They showed no obvious markings or symbols. They were simply stones. Yet something about them felt deliberately placed, intentionally spaced. It reminded Fletcher of military fortifications, defensive positions designed to hold a line against an approaching enemy. He stopped at the southern marker, where Eleanor had always left her supply lists. There was no list today, but there was something else. Carved into the top of the stone, fresh enough that the chisel marks were still sharp, was a single word: run. Fletcher dismounted and examined the carving more closely. The letters were uneven, carved in haste. Eleanor's final warning. But a warning against what? And why had she not simply left? If something dangerous was here, why stay? Why choose isolation for 22 years just to watch something that could apparently kill with such ease? One of Fletcher's soldiers, a young private named Samuel Reed, pointed toward the cabin. "Captain, the door is open. Should we investigate?" Fletcher studied the cabin from a distance. The door stood open exactly as it had been found 6 days earlier. The November wind moved through the doorway, but nothing else stirred. No smoke from the chimney, no sound of life. The cabin looked abandoned, but Fletcher had fought enough battles to recognize when something felt wrong. And this felt very wrong. He gave the order. 3 soldiers would remain with the horses outside the stone circle. 6 soldiers, including Fletcher, would cross the marker line and approach the cabin on foot. They would move slowly. They would stay together, and they would be ready for anything. The 6 men stepped over the southern marker stone and entered Eleanor Thorne's property. The temperature dropped immediately. It was a subtle change, perhaps only 5 degrees, but Fletcher noticed it. So did the others. Private Reed whispered, "Sir, does it feel colder to you inside the circle?" Fletcher nodded but said nothing. They continued forward. The ground inside the circle was different. Outside the markers, the forest floor was covered in pine needles, fallen leaves, and the typical debris of an Appalachian woodland. Inside the circle, the ground was bare earth, clean, almost swept, as if nothing was allowed to accumulate here, as if something had been maintained with obsessive care. As they approached the cabin, Fletcher saw the 7 stones on the table through the open doorway. The message painted in dried blood, "It is free now, forgive me." He had been told about this discovery, but seeing it in person sent a chill through his military discipline. Fletcher reached the threshold and called out, "This is Captain William Fletcher of the Union Army. If anyone is present, identify yourself." Silence. The kind of silence that feels like it is listening. He stepped inside. The cabin was small. A single room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace, and shelves holding supplies. Everything was immaculate. Everything was in order. But the walls were covered in writing. Fletcher moved closer, holding his oil lamp high. The writing was in pencil, tiny letters covering every inch of wall space from floor to ceiling. It was not random. It was organized, structured. It looked like some kind of code or cipher, repeated patterns that almost but not quite made sense. And then Fletcher realized what he was looking at. It was not a code. It was a language, an ancient language he did not recognize. And it was written in perfect, endless repetition, the same phrase over and over and over again, thousands of times covering every surface. One of the soldiers, a corporal named Henry Moss, who had studied classics at university before the war, leaned close to examine the writing. He traced the letters with his finger, his lips moving as he tried to sound out the words. Then he stepped back, his face pale. "Captain," he said quietly, "this is not English. This is not any European language I have studied, but I recognize the structure. It is a binding phrase, a containment spell, the kind of thing ancient cultures used to trap malevolent spirits or entities. And sir," he paused, his voice shaking slightly, "she has written this phrase approximately 10,000 times on these walls, maybe more." Fletcher felt his rational mind struggling against what he was seeing. He was a military man. He believed in tactics and logistics and the cold reality of war. He did not believe in spirits or magic or anything that could not be measured and understood. But 10,000 repetitions of an ancient binding phrase, written on the walls of a cabin by a woman who had isolated herself for 22 years specifically to watch something. He turned to leave. They needed to regroup. They needed to think. But as Fletcher reached the doorway, Private Reed called out from outside. His voice was high with panic. "Captain! Captain, you need to see this." Fletcher rushed out of the cabin. Reed was standing 50 yards away, near the eastern edge of the stone circle, pointing toward the forest beyond the markers. The other soldiers had gathered around him, all staring in the same direction. Fletcher followed their gaze and felt his heart stop. Standing just outside the stone circle, perfectly still among the pine trees, was a figure. It looked like a person, but something about its proportions was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an angle that should have broken its neck. And even from a distance, Fletcher could see that it had no face. Where eyes and nose and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching them, waiting. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, something spoke, not with a human voice, but with a sound that Fletcher's mind could only interpret as words. "Eleanor is gone. The circle is broken. You should not have come here. Now I know your names too." Fletcher heard his own name whispered in that terrible voice. He heard the names of all his soldiers, each one spoken clearly, perfectly, as if the speaker had known them all their lives. And then the faceless figure in the forest began to walk toward them, crossing the boundary that Eleanor Thorne had maintained for 22 years, the boundary that should have kept it contained, but no longer did. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, like a puppet with cut strings, trying to remember how to walk. Fletcher drew his service revolver and fired 3 shots directly at the approaching figure. All 3 rounds hit center mass. The figure did not even slow down. It just kept walking, getting closer, its blank face somehow fixed on them despite having no eyes. "Run!" Fletcher shouted. "Back to the horses, now!" The 6 soldiers turned and ran. Behind them, that terrible voice laughed, a sound like wind through a grave, and said, "You cannot run from something that knows your name. I will find you. I will find all of you, just like I found Eleanor." They reached the horses and mounted in seconds. Fletcher looked back one final time. The faceless figure was now standing at the southern marker stone, exactly where Eleanor had left her final warning carved in desperate haste: "Run." The figure raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at Fletcher. And then, for just a moment, Fletcher saw Eleanor Thorne standing behind the figure, her face twisted in agony, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes begging for forgiveness. Then both figures vanished as if they had never existed at all. The forest was empty, the wind died, and the 9 Union soldiers rode down Devil's Ridge faster than they had ever ridden before, knowing that they had unleashed something that Eleanor Thorne had spent 22 years of her life keeping contained. And knowing that it was now free to do whatever it wanted, to whoever it wanted, for as long as it wanted. Captain Fletcher and his 8 soldiers rode in silence back to the valley. None of them spoke about what they had seen. None of them wanted to admit that the rational world they believed in had just shattered like glass. But as they descended the winding trail from Devil's Ridge, each man felt the same terror. They had heard their names, all of them, spoken by something that should not exist. They reached the valley just before dusk. Fletcher's remaining soldiers were waiting in the town square, standing guard over the nervous civilians. The captain dismounted and immediately ordered a full perimeter around the town. No one enters, no one leaves. Guards posted at every road. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The expression on his face told them everything. That night, Fletcher gathered his most trusted officers in the local church. He needed to understand what Eleanor Thorne had been doing on that mountain for 22 years. And he needed to find out if there was any way to contain what had been released. Because one thing was certain now. Thomas Whitmore and the 4 others had not died from natural causes. They had died because something knew their names. And now that same thing knew the names of 9 Union soldiers. Fletcher sent 2 men to search Eleanor's cabin more thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain the writing on the walls, the binding phrase repeated 10,000 times. He sent 3 men to interview every person in the valley who had ever interacted with Eleanor, no matter how briefly. And he sent 1 man, Corporal Henry Moss, to ride south to Lexington and consult with scholars at Transylvania University about ancient containment rituals. While they worked, Fletcher began documenting everything in his personal journal. He was a military man. He believed in records. He believed in evidence. Even if what he had witnessed defied explanation, he would write it down with clarity and precision. Because if they all died, someone needed to know what happened here. Someone needed to know what Eleanor Thorne had been protecting them from. The first report came back at midnight. Private Samuel Reed and another soldier had returned from Eleanor's cabin with a leather-bound book they had found hidden beneath the floorboards. The book was a journal written in Eleanor's hand, spanning 22 years of entries. Fletcher opened it with hands that trembled slightly despite his discipline. The journal began on October 3rd, 1841, the day Eleanor arrived in Pike County. The first entry read, "I have found it. The place where it is weakest. The place where the boundary is thin enough to watch but strong enough to hold. I do not know how long I can maintain this vigil. I do not know if I will survive even 1 year. But someone must watch. Someone must keep it from crossing over. And no one else knows what I know. No one else saw what I saw in Vermont. Vermont. Fletcher turned the page, reading faster now. Eleanor's entries described her past in fragmentary details. She had lived in a small Vermont town called Hartwick. In October of 1839, something had emerged in those mountains. Something ancient, something that had been contained beneath a stone circle, similar to the one Eleanor later built in Kentucky. But the circle in Vermont had been broken by loggers who did not understand what they were destroying. 17 people died in Hartwick over the course of 3 weeks, all of them in ways that defied medical explanation, all of them after the entity learned their names. Eleanor had been the local school teacher. She had researched the old stones, discovered their purpose, and learned the binding phrase from a book her grandfather had left her. He had been a scholar of ancient languages, a man obsessed with folklore and forgotten religions. Eleanor had attempted to rebuild the circle in Vermont, but it was too late. Too many people had died. The entity had fed on the deaths, growing stronger. So Eleanor made a desperate decision. She would lead it away. She would find another place where the boundary between worlds was thin. She would create a new circle, and she would watch it for the rest of her life, speaking the binding phrase every dawn and dusk to keep it contained. It had worked for 22 years, but the journal's final entry, dated November 13th, 1863, one day before she disappeared, revealed the terrible truth. I am dying. I feel it in my bones. The sickness that took my mother is taking me now. I have perhaps days remaining, maybe hours. I thought I would have more time. I thought I could find someone to take my place. But there is no one. No one would believe. No one would agree to this isolation. When I die, the circle will fail. The binding will break, and it will be free again. God forgive me. I do not know what else to do. Fletcher closed the journal slowly. Eleanor Thorne had not abandoned her post. She had died, and in dying, she had released the very thing she spent half her lifetime containing. The evidence was clear now. Thomas Whitmore and the others had died because they crossed into the circle after the binding failed. They had entered the territory of something that had been imprisoned for over 2 decades, something hungry and angry and finally free. But what was it? The journal called it by no specific name. Eleanor referred to it only as the entity, the thing beyond, or sometimes simply it. She described it as something that existed between states of being, not quite physical, not quite spirit. Something that could only maintain presence in the physical world by feeding on human life force. And the way it fed was precise. It had to know your name, your true name, the one you thought of yourself as. Once it knew your name, it could find you anywhere. It could reach into your body and simply take what it needed. And it now knew the names of 9 soldiers. Fletcher looked up at Private Reed, who'd been standing silently while the captain read. How many hours until dawn, Private? Reed checked his pocket watch. About 5 hours, sir. Fletcher nodded grimly. Everyone stays together until sunrise. No one goes anywhere alone. We watch each other. And if anything happens, if anyone sees or hears anything unusual, we sound the alarm immediately. Understood. Yes, sir. But Reed hesitated. Captain, what if it comes for us tonight? What if knowing our names is enough? What if distance does not matter? It matters, Fletcher said with more confidence than he felt. Thomas Whitmore and the others were killed near Devil's Ridge. The entity seems limited to a specific radius from the circle. As long as we stay in the valley, we should be safe. Should be. He did not miss the uncertainty in his own voice. The night passed in tense silence. Fletcher's soldiers took shifts, 6 men awake at all times, while the others tried unsuccessfully to sleep. The civilians remained in their homes, doors bolted, windows shuttered. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for dawn. And dawn came, November 21st, 1863. The sun rose over the Appalachian ridges, burning off the morning mist. Fletcher allowed himself a small breath of relief. They had survived the night. Maybe distance really was enough. Maybe the entity's power had limits. Maybe they could simply leave Pike County and never return. Then the screaming started. It came from a farmhouse on the eastern edge of town. Fletcher and 6 soldiers ran toward the sound, weapons drawn. They burst through the farmhouse door to find a scene of absolute horror. The farmer, Jacob Brennan, the same man who had cared for Eleanor's supplies for 22 years, was standing in the center of his kitchen. His wife and 2 children were huddled in the corner, screaming, and Jacob was pulling his own teeth out one by one with a pair of pliers. He was smiling. His mouth was a ruin of blood and exposed gums, but he was smiling, as if this brought him profound joy. Fletcher and his men tried to restrain him, but Jacob fought with inhuman strength. It took 4 soldiers to hold him down, and as they struggled, Jacob began to speak in a voice that was not his own. It said, "I know all your names now. I learned them from Jacob. He was so eager to share, so eager to please me. And now I know where each of you lives, where your families live, where everyone you have ever loved can be found. The distance means nothing. I can be anywhere. I can be anyone. You cannot run from something that knows your name. And if this investigation is drawing you in so far, tap that like button. It genuinely helps Appalachian Shadows bring more of these forgotten cases to light. These stories from the mountains deserve to be told. Jacob Brennan died at noon, his body simply giving out after hours of torment. But the damage was done. Whatever the entity was, it had learned to possess the living. And through Jacob, it had acquired the names of everyone in Pike County. Hundreds of people, dozens of families, all of them now vulnerable. Fletcher made an immediate decision. Everyone had to leave. The entire town had to be evacuated. It was a logistical nightmare. Most families had never traveled more than 50 miles from their homes. The roads were dangerous with Confederate raiders. Winter was coming, but staying meant death. That much was clear. He gave the order. Pack only what you can carry. We leave within 2 hours. Head west toward Lexington. The Union Army has fortifications there. We can protect you until we figure out how to stop this thing. But as the townspeople scrambled to gather their belongings, Corporal Henry Moss returned from his ride to Lexington. His horse was lathered with sweat, pushed to its limits. Moss dismounted and nearly collapsed. Fletcher caught him. Report, Corporal. Moss took several ragged breaths before speaking. Captain, I found a professor at Transylvania University, a man named Dr. Albert Whitmore. He studies ancient folklore and containment rituals. When I described Eleanor's journal and the binding phrase on the cabin walls, he knew immediately what we were dealing with. He has seen cases like this before, not in America, but in Europe, in places with old names and older histories. And what did he say we should do? Moss looked at Fletcher with eyes that held no hope. He said there are only 2 ways to contain an entity like this. The first is to rebuild the circle and reinstate the binding with someone willing to watch it for the rest of their life, someone who will never leave, someone who will repeat the phrase every dawn and dusk for decades, forever. Fletcher felt his stomach sink. And the second way? Moss swallowed hard. Complete destruction, not of the entity. You cannot destroy something that barely exists in our world, but destruction of everyone it has named. If all the people whose names it knows are dead, it loses its anchor to our reality. It gets pulled back to whatever place it came from. It starves, it fades, it goes back to sleep. Fletcher stared at the young corporal. You are saying the only way to stop this thing is to kill everyone in this town? Dr. Whitmore said there is no other way, Captain. It already knows too many names. It will hunt them down one by one. It will torture them. It will possess them. And it will use them to learn even more names. The infection spreads exponentially. By next week, it could know the names of thousands. By next month, tens of thousands. It feeds on death. It grows stronger with every victim. If we do not stop it here, it will spread across the entire region, maybe beyond. Fletcher wanted to reject this. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea of murdering hundreds of innocent civilians to stop something they could barely understand. But he was a military man. He understood sacrifices. He understood impossible choices. He had seen entire companies wiped out during the war to save regiments. He had ordered men to their deaths because strategy demanded it. But this was different. These were families, children, people who had done nothing wrong except live in a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. He turned to Moss. Did Dr. Whitmore have any other suggestions? Anything at all? Moss nodded slowly. He said, if we could find someone willing to take Eleanor's place, someone willing to rebuild the circle and maintain the vigil, we might be able to contain it again before it spreads too far. But Captain, he paused, who would agree to that? Who would willingly isolate themselves on that mountain, speaking a binding phrase twice daily for the rest of their life, knowing they could never leave, never have a family, never know anything? But loneliness and duty. Fletcher looked around at his soldiers, at the terrified townspeople packing their belongings, at the mountains rising in the distance, beautiful and terrible. He thought about Eleanor Thorne, about the choice she had made 22 years ago, about the sacrifice she had endured in silence. And he made his decision. Be honest with me in the comments. If you were Captain Fletcher, would you have tried to find someone willing to take Eleanor's place on the mountain? Or would you have considered the other option, the terrible mathematics of sacrifice that war had taught him too well? Because I have thought about this a lot while researching this case, and I am still not sure there was a right answer. Fletcher called together his officers and the town's remaining leaders. He explained the two options with brutal clarity. Either they find a volunteer to become the new watcher, or they consider evacuation, knowing the entity would eventually catch up to them. He did not mention Dr. Whitmore's third option. He could not yet. The discussion lasted for 3 hours. Some argued for immediate evacuation. Others believed they should fight, though fight how they could not say. A few of the older residents suggested making an offering to the entity, giving it what it wanted in hopes it would leave them alone. Fletcher dismissed that idea immediately. You do not negotiate with something that feeds on death. Finally, a young woman stood up. Her name was Catherine Reed, sister to Private Samuel Reed. She was 19 years old, unmarried, with no living family except her brother. She had been one of the few people who regularly left supplies for Eleanor at the stone marker. She had never spoken to the woman, but she had seen her silhouette walking the circle at dawn and dusk for years. Catherine said, I will go. I will take her place. The room fell silent. Samuel Reed jumped to his feet. Catherine, no, you do not know what you are saying. You would be alone up there for the rest of your life. I know, Catherine replied calmly, but someone has to do it, and Eleanor did it for us for 22 years. She protected all of us without asking for anything in return. The least I can do is try to continue what she started. She turned to Fletcher. Captain, what do I need to do? Fletcher felt a mix of relief and horror. He explained what Dr. Whitmore had told Corporal Moss. Catherine would need to rebuild the stone circle. She would need to learn the binding phrase and speak it at dawn and dusk every day without fail. She would need to stay within the circle's boundaries permanently. Any break in the ritual, any lapse in vigilance, and the entity would be free again. Catherine listened to all of this without flinching. Then she asked a question that Fletcher had not considered. Will it try to stop me? When I attempt to rebuild the circle, will the entity fight back? Fletcher did not know. Dr. Whitmore had not mentioned that possibility, but it made sense. Why would something that had just gained freedom allow itself to be imprisoned again? The entity had killed 5 people already. It had possessed Jacob Brennan. It had learned hundreds of names. It had power now, momentum. Why would it let one 19-year-old woman trap it again? The answer came at sunset, as Catherine Reed prepared to ride up to Devil's Ridge with supplies and instructions from Dr. Whitmore. delivered by Corporal Moss just hours earlier. Every person in Pike County whose name the entity knew began to receive a message. The message came in different ways. Some heard it as a whisper in their minds. Others saw it written in frost on their windows. A few found it carved into their front doors when they opened them. But the message was the same for everyone. Catherine Reed, 19 years old, lives on Maple Street, sister to Private Samuel Reed. She thinks she can trap me again. She thinks she can be the next Watcher. She is wrong, and tonight I will show all of you what happens to those who try to contain me. Do not help her. Do not support her. Let her go to the mountain alone, because if you try to help, I will know, and I will take everyone you love. Fletcher read the message carved into the church door and knew they had already lost. The entity was intelligent, strategic. It understood human nature. It knew that fear could isolate Catherine more effectively than any physical barrier. And isolated, alone, without support or protection, how could she possibly rebuild what Eleanor had maintained for over 2 decades? But Catherine Reed surprised him. When Fletcher went to her home to tell her that the plan was too dangerous, that they needed to find another way, he found her sitting calmly at her kitchen table. She had packed a single bag with supplies. She had written a letter to her brother, saying goodbye and explaining her choice. And she was waiting for dusk to pass so she could begin the journey up Devil's Ridge at dawn. Catherine looked at Fletcher and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Captain, I am not brave. I am terrified. But I have been watching Eleanor Thorne walk that circle every dawn and dusk since I was a little girl. I always wondered what she was doing. Now I know. She was choosing duty over fear, and if she could do it for 22 years, I can at least try." Fletcher wanted to stop her. He wanted to order his men to prevent her from going. But what authority? Did he have to stop someone from choosing sacrifice? What right did he have to deny her the chance to save hundreds of lives, even at the cost of her own freedom? He made arrangements. 6 soldiers would escort Catherine to Devil's Ridge. They would help her rebuild the stone circle. They would stand guard while she learned the binding phrase. And then they would leave her there, alone, just as Eleanor had been alone. The group departed at dawn on November 22nd. Fletcher did not go with them. He stayed in the valley, organizing the defense of the town in case the entity attacked during Catherine's attempt to rebuild the containment. Private Samuel Reed led the escort, despite his sister begging him to stay behind. "I need to see you safe," he told her. "I need to know you make it to the circle before I leave you there." They reached Devil's Ridge 2 hours later. Eleanor's cabin still stood with its door open and the 7 stones still arranged on the table. But something had changed. The stone markers forming the circle's perimeter had been moved. Every single one of them had been shifted inward by exactly 10 feet, shrinking the circle's diameter and breaking the geometric precision Eleanor had maintained. The entity had already begun to sabotage them. Catherine stared at the displaced stones and then set her jaw with determination. "Then we moved them back. Samuel, help me." For the next 4 hours, Catherine and the 6 soldiers worked to restore the stone circle to its original configuration. It was exhausting labor. Each stone weighed well over 100 pounds. Moving them back into position required ropes, wooden poles for leverage, and multiple men working together. The entire time, the soldiers felt they were being watched, not by human eyes, by something that had no eyes but could see everything. By noon, the circle was restored. Catherine stood at the northern marker and pulled out the instructions Dr. Whitmore had sent. The binding phrase needed to be spoken in a specific ancient language, a precursor to Sanskrit that most scholars believed had been dead for 3,000 years. But somehow Eleanor Thorne had known it, and now Catherine would need to learn it. She practiced the pronunciation, following the phonetic guide Whitmore had provided. The phrase was roughly 7 syllables long, though the sounds were unlike anything in English. It translated approximately to, "I name you, I bind you, I keep you contained until the stars fall." Catherine repeated it over and over, fixing the sounds in her memory. At dusk, she walked the perimeter of the stone circle for the first time, just as Eleanor had done twice daily for 22 years. Catherine stopped at each cardinal direction and spoke the binding phrase, north, east, south, west. Her voice was steady despite her fear, and as she completed the circle, something changed in the air. A tension, a resistance, as if reality itself was pushing back against what she was doing. The soldiers felt it too. Private Reed told Fletcher later that it was like standing in the eye of a storm. The pressure was immense, suffocating, but the storm held its position. The binding was working. Catherine finished the circuit and returned to the cabin. She stood in the doorway and looked at her brother one final time. "I will be all right, Samuel. You need to go now. Before dark, please." Samuel Reed wanted to stay. He wanted to refuse to leave his sister in this terrible place. But he had his orders. And more than that, he had his sister's request. He nodded once, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Then he and the other 5 soldiers mounted their horses and began the descent back to the valley. They had ridden perhaps half a mile when they heard the screaming. It was Catherine. Her voice echoed across the mountains, raw with agony and terror. Samuel yanked his horse around and started back up the trail. The other soldiers tried to stop him, but he fought past them. He had to reach her. He had to help. He reached the stone circle just as night fell. The cabin door was closed now. The lights were off, and Catherine was nowhere to be seen. Samuel called her name, his voice breaking. No response. He dismounted and ran toward the southern marker, preparing to cross into the circle. And then he heard his sister's voice. But it was not coming from the cabin. It was coming from the forest, from multiple directions simultaneously. The voice said, "Samuel, my dear brother, I am everywhere now. I'm in the trees. I am in the ground. I am in the wind." The entity let me try to rebuild the circle because it wanted to see if I could. And I succeeded. The binding holds, but there was a price. There is always a price. To bind it, I had to offer something in exchange. And I offered myself. Samuel fell to his knees as understanding crashed over him. Catherine had not just rebuilt Eleanor's vigil. She had done something Eleanor had never attempted. She had strengthened the binding by making herself part of it. She had merged her existence with the circle itself. She was the circle now, permanent, unchanging, eternal, and that meant she could never die, could never age, could never leave, not for decades, not for centuries, not for however long it took for the entity to finally starve and fade, from lack of names to hunt. Samuel Reed screamed his sister's name into the darkness, but the only response was laughter. Not from Catherine, from something else. Something ancient and cruel and now bound once again. But not defeated. Never defeated. Just contained. Just waiting. Just biding its time until the next inevitable moment when the circle would fail and it would be free again. And Fletcher, reading Samuel Reed's report the next morning, knew that they had won only a temporary victory. Because binding something is not the same as destroying it. And temporary victories in an eternal war mean nothing at all. Samuel Reed never recovered from that night. Fletcher noted in his journal that the young private returned to camp in a state of profound shock, unable to speak for 3 full days. When his voice finally returned, he requested discharge from military service. Fletcher granted it immediately. There was no point forcing a man to fight a war when he had already lost everything that mattered. Samuel left Pike County and never returned, but he carried the story with him for the rest of his life. Captain Fletcher remained in Pike County for another 2 weeks, documenting everything and attempting to understand what had actually happened on Devil's Ridge. The deaths stopped immediately after Catherine Reed completed the binding. No more murders, no more possessions, no more whispers carrying people's names on the wind. The entity was contained again. But at what cost? Fletcher ordered daily patrols to check on Catherine, or rather, to check on the stone circle where Catherine now existed in some form that defied his understanding. The soldiers would ride up to Devil's Ridge, confirm that the circle remained intact, and return with reports that made less sense each time. One soldier reported seeing a figure walking the perimeter at dawn, but when he looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Another claimed he heard singing coming from the cabin, a woman's voice performing the binding phrase in perfect rhythm, but the cabin itself was empty. A third found fresh supplies inside the cabin, food and water and firewood, even though no one had crossed the stone markers to deliver them. The circle was maintaining itself, or Catherine was maintaining it, or something was maintaining it that Fletcher's rational mind could not categorize. Whatever the truth the containment held, the entity remained bound, and Pike County slowly began to return to normal, though normal would never mean the same thing it had meant before. Fletcher wrote his final report on December 7, 1863. He documented every death, every witness statement, every impossible event. He described Eleanor Thorne's 22-year vigil and Catherine Reed's sacrifice. He explained the binding circle and the ancient phrase and the entity that existed between states of being. He wrote it all with the precision of a military officer and the wonder of a man whose worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the span of 3 weeks. And then he did something he had never done in his entire military career. He requested that his report be classified and sealed. He wrote a letter to his commanding officer explaining that the information contained within these documents was too dangerous to become public knowledge. If people knew that such entities could be bound but not destroyed, if they knew that the boundaries between worlds were thin in certain places, if they knew that ancient rituals still held power in the modern age, the consequences could be catastrophic. Either no one would believe it and the warning would be wasted, or everyone would believe it and panic would ensue. Neither outcome served the greater good. Better to seal the records. Better to let Pike County's nightmare fade into local legend and folklore. Better to protect the truth by hiding it. Fletcher's request was granted. His journal and all related documents were stamped, classified, and locked in a military archive in Washington. They remained there for 83 years, untouched and unread, until a historian researching Civil War medical records accidentally stumbled across them in 1946. But that is a different story. For now, we need to return to November of 1863 and answer the questions that Fletcher himself struggled with until his death 40 years later. What was Eleanor Thorne running from in Vermont? What exactly was the entity she spent her life containing? And most importantly, what happened to Catherine Reed after she merged with the binding circle? The answers are incomplete. They will always be incomplete. But from Fletcher's journal and from the few other surviving documents, we can piece together enough of the truth to understand why this story was buried. Eleanor Thorne's past in Vermont was confirmed by later investigation. The town of Hartwick really existed. It was abandoned in 1839 after a series of unexplained deaths that the official record attributed to a fever outbreak. But local folklore told a different story. It spoke of something that emerged from beneath a circle of standing stones when loggers destroyed them to clear land for a mill. It spoke of 17 deaths in 3 weeks. It spoke of a school teacher named Eleanor who studied her grandfather's books and learned how to trap the thing again, but not before it had already learned too many names. The description of the entity itself varied depending on who was asked. Some called it a demon. Others called it a spirit of the old world, something that existed before humans and would exist after them. A few of the more educated residents suggested it was something even stranger, a being from a dimension that overlapped with ours in certain places where the fabric of reality was thin. Dr. Albert Whitmore, the scholar Corporal Moss consulted in Lexington, had his own theory. He believed entities like this were fragments of pre-human consciousness, remnants of the age before recorded history when different laws governed existence. They fed on names because names were power. To know someone's true name was to have a connection to their life force, their essential being. The entities could follow those connections anywhere, across any distance, and drain the life from their victims. The binding circles worked because they created geometric prisons that such entities could not cross. The specific placement of stones, the precise measurements, the repeated phrases, all of it combined to create a cage made of intention and willpower rather than physical matter. But the cage required constant maintenance, a watcher who never left, a speaker who never stopped, a sacrifice that lasted a lifetime. Eleanor Thorne had made that sacrifice. She had walked away from any possibility of a normal life, isolated herself on a mountain for 22 years, and died alone, knowing that her death would release the very thing she had worked so hard to contain. Her final carved message, "Run," was not just a warning, it was an apology. She had failed, not through lack of dedication or courage, but simply through the mortality that claims all human beings eventually. And Catherine Reed had understood this. When she offered to take Eleanor's place, she knew it was not just about walking the circle and speaking the phrase. It was about accepting that the rest of her life would be defined by duty, isolation, and eternal vigilance. But she had done something Eleanor never attempted. She had found a way to make the binding permanent by merging her own existence with the circle itself. How she accomplished this, no one knew. Dr. Whitmore speculated that she had modified the binding phrase, adding elements that bound not just the entity, but also herself. She had essentially created a balance. The entity was trapped inside the circle. Catherine was trapped as the circle. And as long as both remained bound, the containment would hold indefinitely. The implications were staggering. Catherine Reed would never age. She would never die. She would never leave Devil's Ridge. She existed now in a state between life and death, human and something else, maintaining the prison that held an ancient horror. She was 19 years old in November of 1863. And if the binding still held, she was still 19 years old today, still walking the circle at dawn and dusk, still speaking the phrase that kept the darkness contained. Fletcher tried to verify this theory before he left Pike County. He returned to Devil's Ridge one final time on December 6, 1863. He crossed the southern marker stone and approached the cabin alone, against the advice of every soldier in his command. He needed to know if Catherine was truly gone or if some part of her remained. The cabin was clean, immaculate, just as it had been when Eleanor lived there. There was food on the shelves, water in the pitcher, firewood stacked by the hearth. Everything suggested occupation, but there was no sign of Catherine herself. No clothing, no personal items, nothing that indicated a 19-year-old woman lived here. Fletcher sat at the table where the 7 stones had been arranged with their bloody message. Those stones were gone now. The table was bare. He took out his journal and wrote a final entry addressed to Catherine, even though he did not know if she could read it or if reading mattered to whatever she had become. He wrote, "Catherine Reed, if any part of you remains aware, if any fragment of the girl who chose this path can still understand words, I want you to know that you saved hundreds of lives, possibly thousands. The entity has not claimed another victim since you completed the binding. The people of Pike County will never know what you did for them. They will never know your sacrifice, but I know. And I will make certain that your story is recorded, even if it must remain classified. You are a hero, you are a guardian, and you will not be forgotten." Fletcher left the journal entry on the table and departed. When soldiers checked the cabin the next day, the page was gone. Whether Catherine took it, or the wind carried it away, or something else removed it, Fletcher never learned. But he chose to believe she read it. He chose to believe some part of her understood. The years that followed 1863 brought profound changes to America. The Civil War ended in 1865. Reconstruction began and failed and left the South scarred for generations. The country expanded westward, building railroads and cities and transforming wilderness into civilization. Technology advanced at an accelerating pace. The world moved on, but Devil's Ridge remained unchanged. The stone circle stood in perfect formation year after year. The cabin showed no signs of decay despite the harsh mountain weather. And people who hiked the area, hunters and travelers and curious locals, all reported the same experience. They felt watched, they felt unwelcome, they felt a presence that suggested they should leave and never return. Most obeyed that feeling. Those who did not, those who crossed the stone markers out of curiosity or defiance or simple ignorance, tended to leave the area quickly. They could not explain why, they just knew they needed to be elsewhere. The binding was not just containing the entity anymore. It was also protecting people from getting too close. Pike County residents developed a tradition. Once a year, on November 14th, the anniversary of Eleanor Thorne's disappearance, someone would hike up to Devil's Ridge and leave a small offering at the southern marker stone. Flowers, food, a simple thank you carved into a piece of wood. The tradition passed from generation to generation. Most people who participated did not know the full story. They knew only that someone had protected them long ago. Someone had made a sacrifice that deserved remembrance. Fletcher left the military in 1868 and returned to his home state of Massachusetts. He married. He had children. He built a quiet life far from the mountains and the horrors he had witnessed. But he never stopped thinking about Devil's Ridge. He never stopped wondering if Catherine Reed was still there, still walking, still watching. In 1891, 28 years after the events in Pike County, Fletcher received a letter. It had no return address. The postmark was smudged and unreadable. Inside was a single page written in a woman's handwriting he did not recognize. The letter said, "Captain Fletcher, I wanted you to know that I am still here. I am still watching. The years do not touch me anymore. I do not sleep. I do not eat. I do not grow older. But I remember everything. I remember my brother's face when he rode away. I remember your kindness when you wrote that journal entry. I remember why I chose this path. And I do not regret it. There are worse things than isolation. There are worse fates than eternal vigilance. At least I know my purpose. At least I know I am preventing something terrible from spreading. Thank you for recording the truth. Thank you for not forgetting. Catherine." Fletcher kept that letter until his death in 1903. He showed it to no one. He did not know if it was really from Catherine or if someone had discovered his classified report and was playing a cruel joke. But in his heart, he believed it was real. He believed Catherine Reed had found a way to reach across the decades and reassure him that the sacrifice had meaning. The letter raised as many questions as it answered. If Catherine could send letters, did that mean she retained some degree of agency within the binding? If she remembered her past, did that mean she suffered from loneliness and loss? If the years did not touch her, what would happen when centuries passed and everyone who knew her story was dead and gone? These questions haunted Fletcher for the rest of his life. And they haunt us now, over 160 years later, as we try to understand what really happened on Devil's Ridge in November of 1863. The classified documents were finally declassified in 1997 after pressure from historians studying Civil War military records. Fletcher's journal was published in a small academic press in 2001, attracting minimal attention beyond specialist circles. Most readers dismissed it as fiction or the delusions of a traumatized soldier trying to make sense of wartime horrors. But a few people took it seriously. A few researchers made the journey to Pike County, Kentucky, to see if Devil's Ridge still existed. They found it. The stone circle was still there, weathered but intact. The cabin had finally collapsed sometime in the late 20th century, but the foundation stones marked where it once stood. And people still left offerings at the southern marker, fresh flowers, recent carvings, signs that the tradition continued even in the modern age. One researcher, a folklorist named Jennifer Walsh, spent 3 days camping near Devil's Ridge in 2015. She documented her experience in a paper that was largely ignored by mainstream academia, but circulated widely in paranormal research communities. Walsh reported feeling a constant sense of being observed. She heard rhythmic sounds at dawn and dusk that resembled chanting or singing. And on her final night, she photographed something moving along the perimeter of the stone circle. The photograph shows a vague figure, translucent and indistinct, walking with deliberate purpose. It could be a trick of light, it could be camera malfunction. But Walsh believed she had captured an image of Catherine Reed, still walking her endless circuit 152 years after she merged with the binding circle. The truth is, we will never know for certain. We cannot know. The nature of what happened on Devil's Ridge defies scientific verification. It exists in that liminal space between history and legend, fact and folklore, reality and myth. What we can say with certainty is this: Eleanor Thorne lived on that mountain for 22 years, isolated and vigilant, protecting people who never knew they needed protection. When she died, Catherine Reed took her place, making a sacrifice that lasted far longer than a human lifetime should allow. And to this day, something still watches from Devil's Ridge. Something still walks the stone circle at dawn and dusk. Something still maintains the binding that keeps an ancient horror contained. Whether that something is Catherine Reed or something else, whether she suffers or has transcended suffering, whether she remembers being human or has become something entirely new, we cannot answer. But we can honor the choice she made. We can remember the cost of safety. And we can acknowledge that sometimes, in the deep hollows and high ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, there are guardians we never see protecting us from nightmares we never imagined. This was the terrifying story of Eleanor Thorne and Catherine Reed. A reminder that some people sacrifice everything, not for glory or recognition, but simply because someone must. A reminder that the boundaries between worlds are thinner than we believe. And a reminder that in the Appalachian Mountains, some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but only to be respected and remembered. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person Appalachian Shadows exists for. Someone who does not turn away from the darkness. Someone who wants to understand the truth buried in these mountains, no matter how disturbing. Next week, I am bringing you the story of the Hollow Creek vanishing of 1892. Where an entire church congregation of 47 people disappeared during a Sunday service in the hills of West Virginia. The only clue was a hymnal left open to a song that should not exist. And that case, it makes this one look tame. Subscribe to Appalachian Shadows now and turn on notifications, because these stories from the hollows and ridges do not stay buried forever. One more thing. I know many of you watching are from Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, the Carolinas, Appalachian country. If your family has stories like this, cases that were hushed up, disappearances that were never solved, secrets that were buried in the hollows, share them in the comments. You do not have to use names, just the story. Because I read every single comment. And your stories might become the next investigation here on Appalachian Shadows.